Welcome back to Tartan Lullaby. I'm Archie, and tonight there's a long, quiet story waiting for you. Before we begin, take a moment to settle in. Find your pillow. Soften your shoulders. Let the day go. Tartan Lullaby tells slow stories of Scotland. Real places, real years, real people, told gently enough to fall asleep inside. There's no music tonight, and no need to follow every word. If you drift off in the first few minutes, the rest will play on quietly without you. That's how it's meant to be. If these stories are a quiet corner you find yourself returning to, a subscription would mean a great deal, and it helps us keep making them. The artwork you see throughout tonight's story is available as a print in our Etsy shop, if you'd like to bring a little of Scotland onto your walls. When you're ready, close your eyes and we'll begin. Tonight, the first of 3 nights on Morocco and the Scottish Sea Roads. The Corsair Century. This is Tartan Lullaby, sleep history from Scotland. Close your eyes for a moment. Hold 2 harbours at once. Let them sit side by side in the dark. On one shore, a Clyde port in grey rain. Stone quays slick with drizzle. A warehouse lamp throwing a pale square onto the cobbles. The smell of wet wool and river mud. On the other shore, white walls. Amber light fading above the Atlantic. Salt air carrying something warmer. Spice, baked stone, the last heat of a long day leaving the plaster. 2 coastlines that have looked out at the same ocean for centuries. 2 peoples who understood the same truth. The sea was not a barrier, it was a road. The same gulls wheel above both harbours. Different sea, different sky. The same bird, indifferent to the miles between them, riding the same Atlantic wind. Let both harbours settle, the rain on the Clyde, the amber light on the white walls. We begin. Chapter 1. 2 nations look to the sea. Scotland in the early 18th century is a country remade. The Act of Union with England, signed in 1707, has changed the terms of everything. Before the Union, Scottish merchants sat outside the Great Atlantic trading system. The English Navigation Acts treated them as foreigners. Their goods faced higher duties. Their ships were barred from colonial routes. After 1707, those doors open. Scotland is inside the British trading world now. The ports of the Atlantic and the routes beyond them are, in principle, available. But access is not a market. Scottish merchants still have to find what they can sell and to whom. In the decades after the Union, they look outward with a new urgency. Linen is the great Scottish export of the century. The Board of Manufactures, established in 1727, funds improvements to the weave, the bleach, the finish. By mid-century, Scottish linen is reaching markets that would have been closed 30 years before. Wool comes too, the coarser Highland fleece, the finer lowland clip. Scotland has been a wool nation since before its recorded history. Now that wool moves farther into broader European and Atlantic hands. Alongside the cloth, thread, hardware, and the early manufactured goods of a country beginning to industrialize, Scotland has things to sell. It is looking steadily for buyers. now hold the other side of the exchange. Morocco in the same century is not a diminished or marginal place. It is a sovereign kingdom with deep roots, governing the hinge where the Atlantic meets the Mediterranean. The Alawi dynasty has ruled Morocco since the 1660s. Experienced traders, experienced diplomats, they understand exactly what their country holds and what the wider world will pay for it. Morocco sits astride the old caravan routes that bring goods up from the Sahara and beyond. Leather worked in the great tanning yards of Fez, almonds from the interior groves, beeswax gathered in the Atlas foothills, wool and hides, copper and tin, gum arabic flowing north along the desert tracks, that commodity the European world prizes for ink and glazing and medicine. These are goods the Atlantic world wants. The sultans know this. They have always known this. The knowledge is the basis of their foreign policy. In the early 18th century, both Scotland and Morocco are engaged in the same calculation. What do we have? What does the world need? How do we get our goods to the people who will pay for them? Scotland's answer runs through Glasgow and Leith, through London agents and Lisbon connections, through the expanding web of British Atlantic commerce. Morocco's answer runs through Salé and Tangier, through the Jewish trading families of the coastal cities, through diplomatic relationships managed with considerable care and deliberate skill. Two different geographies, two different political arrangements, the same fundamental question, the same turn toward the sea. The Atlantic is not a neutral space in this period. It is contested and dangerous, traversed by ships of many flags, watched by many interests. The crossing from Scotland south toward Morocco is several weeks in favorable winds. But it has been made. It is being made. Scots wool and Moroccan leather are already moving toward each other along routes neither nation fully controls. In 1757, a new sultan comes to the Moroccan throne. His name is Mohammed ben Abdallah. He has thought carefully about what his kingdom needs. He wants trade. He wants European ships in Moroccan harbors. He begins signing treaties with the European powers, one after another. He curtails the Corsair fleets that have made his coastline feared. He opens his kingdom to commerce on terms he intends to set himself. In 1765, he begins to build. On the Atlantic coast, south of Tangier, a new city takes shape on a site with a natural harbor, fresh water, and winds that push ships north toward Europe. The Europeans call it Mogador. The name its own people will give it is Essaouira. The builders are skilled and the plan is deliberate. A medina behind high walls, a harbor with a breakwater, streets wide enough for loaded mules to pass, warehouses along the seafront. A French architect named Cornut draws the ramparts. The Sultan wants European merchants to feel they can work here. He also wants it known that the city belongs to Morocco. Both things are built into the stone. The Sultan grants this new port a monopoly on the trade of the south. Everything coming up from the interior, everything going out to the Atlantic, passes through here. Era is the funnel. European merchants begin to arrive, British among them. The Jewish trading families of Morocco, invited by the Sultan to settle here, handle much of the brokerage between the European buyers and the Moroccan suppliers. They speak Arabic, Judeo-Berber, Spanish, and several European languages besides. They know the interior routes, the suppliers, the grades of each commodity. A foreign merchant without them is working blind. Picture Era in those years. The harbor at mid-morning, small boats unloading bales onto the quayside, a merchant checking a manifest, the smell of leather and citrus and the sea. Gulls overhead, the same gulls. The exchange is unequal in some ways, as Atlantic trade always was in this period. But the sultans are not passive in this arrangement. They set the terms. They control the port. They negotiate with considerable sophistication on behalf of Morocco. So what does Scotland bring to this world? The same things it is selling everywhere in the 18th century. Cloth above all, linen that can bear a long sea passage, wool and thread. And what comes back? Leather from the Moroccan tanning yards. Soft, supple, dyed in the deep reds and yellows that craftsmen in Fez and Marrakesh have perfected across centuries. It travels north on British ships into Scottish workshops and homes. Almonds from the Moroccan groves, beeswax for candles and polish, hides, the products of a warm interior that Scotland cannot produce and will always need. The trade is rarely direct, ship to ship between Leith and Era. It moves through London, through Lisbon, through Gibraltar. But the Scottish wool and the Moroccan leather are, in the end, heading toward each other. This is the structure of the exchange. Two countries at different ends of the same trading world, their goods moving toward each other along routes neither of them fully controls. The connection accumulates slowly. A bill of lading for Scottish linen in a Tangier warehouse, a note about Moroccan wax in a Leith customs ledger, names in careful handwriting, amounts in old currencies. This is where the relationship lives. Stay with the two harbors for a moment. The Grey Clyde and the Atlantic walls, the wool bales and the leather bales, merchants on both sides checking their ledgers in the lamplight. It is a very old kind of human activity. Two peoples deciding that what the other has is worth the risk of the crossing. And there is always risk. The sea is not only a road, it is also, in the century before these trading relationships settle, a place of real danger. That chapter is ahead of us. We will come to it with honesty. For now, rest here, in the early decades, before the treaties, before the merchants settle, before the difficult century makes its full weight known. The rain on the Clyde, the amber light on white walls, two nations very far apart, discovering they have something the other needs, the oldest basis for a crossing there is. The warehouse lamp gutters in the wet wind off the river. The Era stars come out above the white parapet. The same gulls, already asleep on the harbor wall, one shore and the other, resting between seas. Let your breathing slow. The harbors are quiet now. The water is dark on both shores. There is nothing you need to do. The road between them is still there. The sea holds everything. Asleep. In Chapter 2, The Corsair World. Let the pace slow here. The Corsair century deserves more than a summary. It deserves to be understood on its own terms as a system that worked, had logic, had rules, had people at its center who woke each morning and did what the day asked of them. The sea between Morocco and Scotland was not, in the 17th century, an empty space. It was a working road. Ships moved it in both directions, north with hides and wax and sugar, south with cloth and lead and grain. And along those same routes moved the Corsair vessels. Corsairing was not piracy in the sense of lone criminals beyond any law. It was licensed warfare, authorized seizure, state-sponsored, court-regulated, and deeply integrated into the economies of the cities that practiced it. The licenses were called letters of marque in European waters. The corsairs of the Moroccan Atlantic worked under similar instruments issued by the ruling authority of their port. A captain without authorization was a pirate. A captain with it was something more complicated, a servant of the state at sea. European powers knew this arrangement very well. They used it themselves. English privateers had been raiding Spanish shipping under royal license since the reign of Elizabeth. Dutch vessels operated on the same basis in the East Indies. The French crown issued its own letters. The hard rules of the sea ran in every direction. This is the context that honest history requires. The Corsair world of the Moroccan Atlantic was not an aberration. It was a variation on a system that every major Atlantic power employed when it suited them. The suffering it caused was real. So was the suffering caused by its European equivalents. Now look at where the Moroccan corsairs operated from. The most significant base on the Atlantic coast was Sale, a walled city at the mouth of the Bou Regreg River, directly across from its twin city, Rabat. Sale had been a trading port since before the Islamic period. Its position was good, sheltered anchorage behind the river Bar, a medina whose walls faced both the river and the sea, fresh water available, a population with generations of seafaring knowledge. In the early 17th century, something unusual happened at Sale. A community of Andalusian refugees expelled from Spain in 1609 settled here alongside the existing population. They brought skills and grievances in equal measure. These were the Hornacheros from the Spanish town of Hornachos. They were experienced builders, farmers, craftsmen. They were also, by 1609, people who had lost everything to Spain and had no reason to make peace with the Christian Atlantic world. They brought that edge with them to Sale. Within a generation, Sale and Rabat had become the center of something remarkable. The Republic of the Bou Regreg, a Corsair polity that governed itself by its own council, raised its own revenues from the sea, and answered to no external authority for a significant stretch of the century. The Republic is recorded in the notes of European consuls and the memoirs of captives. It had a divan, a governing council of Corsair captains and merchants. It levied taxes on departing ships. It maintained its own diplomatic contacts with European states seeking the return of their nationals. The records suggest it was an organized, functional society, not a lawless camp, but a city with its own internal order, its own courts, its own sense of what was permitted and what was not. The Corsair economy was regulated because unregulated Corsairing was simply chaos, and chaos was bad for business. By the mid-17th century, the Bou-Regreg Republic was drawing in captains and sailors from across the Mediterranean and beyond. Some were Moroccans and Andalusians. Some were European renegades who had converted to Islam and taken up the Corsair life. These European captains are a significant and often overlooked part of the story. The most famous of them is Jan Jans Zoon, a Dutchman. He operated out of sail for decades under the name Murat Reis the Younger. He knew the North Atlantic intimately because he had grown up sailing it. Jan Jans Zoon raided as far as Iceland. In 1627, his ships reached the village of Baltimore in the south of Ireland. Over 100 people were taken in a single night. They were brought to sale. Most were never seen in Ireland again. The raid was remembered there for generations. The point is not that this was uniquely terrible, though it was terrible. The point is who was doing it. A Dutchman, sailing for a Moroccan city-state, raiding a village in an Irish sea he knew from his own childhood. The Corsair world was not a clash of civilizations. It was a working economy that crossed every boundary. The ships themselves were adapted for the job. In the Mediterranean, Corsairs had traditionally relied on galleys, low, fast, powered by oars when the wind failed, lethal at close quarters. But the Atlantic demanded something different. The Atlantic did not reward the galley. Its long swells, its winter winds, its unpredictable weather over weeks at sea required vessels that could handle sustained passage. The sail Corsairs made the adaptation. By the early 17th century, they were sailing square-rigged ships, ships that could reach Scotland. The round ships of the Atlantic were typically smaller than naval warships. A sail Corsair vessel might carry 30 to 50 men, a handful of cannon, and enough provisions for a long cruise. The cannon were not for large engagements. They were for persuasion. A broadside from a vessel that size was enough to stop a merchant ship without a navy escort. Speed mattered more than firepower. A Corsair vessel that could overhaul a laden merchantman before it reached port had done its work. The tactics were straightforward: intercept, threaten, board. Resistance was possible but rarely cost-effective for the crew of a wool carrier heading south from a Scottish port. The boarding was the critical moment. Accounts from captives describe it with a flat, practical tone that is itself revealing. The Corsair crew came over the side, the cargo was assessed, the men were separated out. It was the assessment that decided your future. A ship's carpenter could be put to work in the yards. A navigator was valuable wherever he went. An experienced sailor was worth more than his ransom. A common laborer had fewer options. The sorting was efficient. The captives were property now, and property was categorized. This was not unique to the Moroccan Corsairs. European slavers sorting enslaved people on the West African coast in the same century used identical logic. The value was in the skill, the age, the physical condition. The same cold arithmetic, running in different directions across the same sea. The captives from the sail ships arrived, usually, at the Bou Regreg mouth. The passage upriver to the city was the first sight of their new situation. The walls of the Medina above the bank, the minarets, the sound of a city going about its business. Everything familiar had been replaced by everything unknown. Sail in the 17th century was not a small or marginal place. It had a functioning economy, the wool trade, the cloth trade, the proceeds of the sea. Its Medina held scholars and merchants and craftsmen alongside the Corsair community. The tanning yards processed leather. The souks sold goods from the Saharan routes and from European ships both. A captive held in sail was held in a city, not a wilderness. That distinction matters. The city had rules, hierarchies, relationships. It could be navigated slowly by a man who kept his head and learned the protocols. Some men did exactly this. The principal place of captivity was the bagnio. The word is Italian, from the Roman bathing tradition, and it had been used for such places throughout the Mediterranean for centuries. A bagnio was a compound where captives were housed communally, supervised, and held pending ransom or use. Conditions in the bagnio varied by city and by decade. The records suggest sails bagnios were not the worst in the Corsair world. Algiers had a grimmer reputation, but no bagnio was comfortable. Overcrowding, inadequate food in poor times, the uncertainty about when or whether ransom would come. What the bagnio also had was community. Men from England, Scotland, Ireland, France, Spain, Portugal, and from further afield held in the same space. Occasionally a common language could be found. Occasionally it could not, and men communicated in the shorthand of the destitute. Gesture, expression, the small transactions of shared captivity. Skilled captives lived differently. A man identified as useful might be taken into a merchant household. A physician might treat the Corsair captain's family. A wright might spend his days in a boatyard, doing recognizable work in an unrecognizable city. These men saw more of sail than the bagnio walls, and some of them left accounts. The accounts are cautious. They were written for European eyes, often with one purpose, to secure the ransom. A man who described his captors with hostility might find the letter intercepted and the ransom process complicated. A man who wrote neutrally, even generously, might find doors opened. The correspondence is diplomatic out of necessity. Some of what comes through the caution is texture. The smell of the city at dawn, baking bread and salt water, and the animal smell of the tanning yards downwind. The sound of the call to prayer carrying over the rooftops. The light on the white walls in the afternoon, very intense, nothing like the grey of a Scottish coast. The food described in a handful of surviving accounts was adequate if unfamiliar. Bread, olive oil, legumes, occasional meat. The diet of a Mediterranean city not the diet of a Fife fishing town. Men from Scotland, accustomed to oats and salt fish, and whatever came off the hill found it strange. Strange was not the same as bad. There was trade within the Banyu. Captives with skills or small possessions could barter. A man who could write in English might copy letters for other captives. A cobbler might repair shoes. The internal economy of the Banyu was modest, but it was real, and it gave men agency, which was itself a form of survival. Outside the Banyu, Sale went about its business. The souks opened at dawn. Merchants from the interior arrived with wool and leather. Ships in the harbor were loaded and unloaded. The Corsair captains inspected their vessels, met with the divan, planned the next cruise. The city that held the captives was a working city, with the ordinary rhythms of a working city. Children played in the lanes of the Medina. Craftsmen in the leather quarter worked the same patterns their fathers had worked. Women bought thread and spice in the covered market. The Corsair economy was integrated into this ordinary life without dominating every aspect of it. Sale was more than its reputation. The Atlantic Wall of Sale was also its strategic heart. The Portuguese had held this coastline in the previous century. Their fortifications, adapted and extended by Moroccan builders, still define the approach to the city from the sea. The escala, the gun platform, mounted cannon that covered the river mouth. Visitors who approached Sale by ship described the wall as formidable, grey-brown stone, low and thick, built to absorb rather than deflect. The guns on the escala were not always in good repair, but their presence was enough. A warship arriving uninvited would find the river mouth defended. A merchant ship invited to trade would pass through with a pilot. The Moroccan sultans, who periodically reasserted authority over the Bou Regreg Republic, maintained their own fortifications at Rabat, across the river. The Kasbah of the Udayas, its gates decorated with elaborate carved plasterwork, stands above the river mouth. It was a statement as much as a military position. Authority resides here. When Moulay Rashid, the first Alawi Sultan, took Sale and Rabat in 1666, ending the Republic's formal independence, the Corsair economy did not end. It was absorbed. The captains now operated under sultanic authority rather than the divans. The letters of marque still went out. The ships still sailed. The proceeds now went partly to the Makhazan, the royal treasury. Under Sultan Moulay Ismail, who ruled from 1672 to 1727, the Corsairs became an instrument of diplomacy. Ismail was a ruler of considerable strategic intelligence. He understood that European captives were currency in two senses, literally as sources of ransom and figuratively as leverage in the diplomatic negotiations he conducted with the great powers. He held European captives at Meknes, his capital, as a deliberate reserve. They worked on his building projects, including the vast palace complex he was constructing. He negotiated their release against political and commercial concessions from European states. He managed the process with the care of a man who understood that an empty hand is a weak hand. The records from Meknes captives describe the building works in detail. enormous walls going up, stone by stone, captive labor working alongside Moroccan laborers and enslaved Africans brought north on the desert routes. The scale of the project was vast. Ismail was building something that was meant to last, and it did. He also negotiated. He exchanged letters with Louis XIV of France, with the English crown, with other European rulers. Some of these letters survive. They are formal, courtly, and absolutely confident. Ismail does not write as a man asking favors. He writes as a sovereign addressing his equals, which is what he was. The peace treaties that slowly reduced the Corsair economy were not one-sided surrenders. They were negotiations between parties who each had something the other wanted. European states wanted their nationals back and their merchants safe. Morocco wanted trade, recognition, and the diplomatic leverage that treaties with major powers provided. In 1682, England signed a treaty with Morocco. France had its own agreements. The process was iterative and imperfect. Treaties were made and strained and remade, but the direction was toward accommodation, toward the peace that would eventually allow the merchant world to function with more security on both sides. The captives who came home arrived changed. The records note this without elaboration. Men returned to Scottish towns quieter than they had left. Some would not talk about what had happened. Some talked of nothing else, to anyone who would listen, repeating the details of the city and the bagnio and the smell of the olive oil and the sound of the call to prayer, as if repetition could make it ordinary. A few of them could speak some Arabic by the time they returned. Not much. Enough to buy bread, to ask a question, to survive the day. This knowledge, impractical in a Fife Harbour town, lived in them anyway. A language no one else around them spoke, acquired in the strangest possible circumstances, worn down to a handful of words by disuse, but not quite gone. The renegades who stayed occupy a different space in the record. These were men who converted to Islam, took new names, and built lives in the Corsair cities. European anti-Islamic propaganda made them monsters. The reality was more human than that. Men in extreme circumstances make choices that are hard to judge from a distance. Some were coerced. Some calculated that survival required conversion. Some, over years, found that the faith they had nominally adopted became something more than nominal. Some married, had children, became part of the cities that had taken them. The Corsair cities were themselves cities of many origins, and one more European making a life there was not remarkable to anyone but the European states still demanding his return. The sea that had brought them there was still visible from the bagnio, from the escala, from the minarets of sail. It was the same Atlantic, the same cold green-grey water that washed the Scottish coast, the same gulls wheeling in the river-mouth wind, indifferent to all borders. That is the Corsair world, not a backdrop to Scottish history, but a system Scotland's sailors entered and endured, and in time survived. The coast that produced it was working and lived in and complex. The people on both sides were doing what the century asked of them, in a world whose rules were hard and applied to everyone in every direction across every sea. In Chapter 3, The Captives and the Kirk. Let us slow here. This chapter asks something of us, not morbid curiosity, not horror at a distant time, just honest attention to what the records show happened to ordinary men. The Corsair century is the name historians give to roughly 1600 to 1740. During those decades, vessels operating out of ports along the Moroccan and Algerian coasts moved regularly into Atlantic waters. Salé, at the mouth of the Bou Regreg River, was among the most active. The men they took were fishermen, merchant sailors, coastal laborers, men doing ordinary working lives close to the water because the water was where the work was. The records suggest the scale was significant. Historians estimate that perhaps 20,000 men and women from the British Isles were taken across this period. The Scottish proportion is harder to isolate, but Scottish sailors worked the routes where the risk was real. No precise figure survives for Scots specifically. The records are local and partial: parish registers, Privy Council petitions, Kirk session minutes. Read together, they suggest a steady, low-level drain from the coastal communities of Scotland year after year for several generations. Fife felt it, Ayrshire felt it. The small harbours of the Forth Estuary felt it. These were not wealthy towns. They had little margin for loss. Begin with what the records say about the taking. A sail sighted from the deck, usually in Atlantic waters south of the latitude of Ireland. Several sails sometimes moving together in a practiced way. The Corsair vessels were well designed for their purpose, fast and maneuverable, crewed by experienced sailors who had made this kind of crossing many times. The encounter was often brief. Merchant vessels were not built for combat. Their crews were outnumbered. The records suggest most surrenders were without significant violence. The cargo was more valuable intact. The men were more valuable alive. The ship was taken or burned. The men were brought aboard. They were now at the beginning of a process that had its own logic, its own economy, its own rules. The crossing to the North African coast took days or weeks, depending on the winds. The men were held below or on deck, according to the weather and the disposition of those who had taken them. The records do not give us much of this part. The men who survived rarely wrote about the crossing itself. The port they entered was most often Salé, though some ended at Algiers or further east. The geography varied. The experience of arrival did not vary much. In the port, European captives were assessed and priced. This was a commercial transaction in a functioning commercial system. The captives' skills were relevant. A navigator fetched more than a deckhand, a carpenter more than a net mender. Skilled hands were an investment. This is not said to soften what it was. Forced labor is forced labor, whatever the ledger calls it. But understanding the system is part of understanding how some men got home and why some did not. The assignments given to captives varied considerably. Some were set to work on galleys. Some were placed in households or in agricultural work on estates outside the cities. Some worked in building and construction. Some, particularly those with specialist knowledge, were employed in ways that made use of what they knew. Many were held in the banlieue, the communal captive quarters of the North African port cities. The name is Italian in origin, which tells you something about who else had passed through. The banlieue was not comfortable. It was crowded, its air heavy in summer, cold in the damp months. Men from different nations and different languages were housed together. French and Dutch and English and Scottish sailors finding common ground in the fact of their shared situation. But the banlieue was not a place to die. The ransom system depended on living captives. Men were fed. Men were kept in sufficient health to work. An asset that dies is worthless. Some men stayed in the banlieue for months, some for years. The length of time depended on factors outside their control, how quickly their families moved, how much the ransom was set at, what the diplomatic weather was between their home state and the Corsair authorities. Now hold the other side of this. The European powers of the same century were running their own slaving economies at a scale that dwarfs what happened to Scottish sailors on the North African coast. Ships from Bristol, Lisbon, Amsterdam, and others carried hundreds of thousands of Africans across the Atlantic. The ledgers of suffering in the 17th century were enormous and ran in more than one direction. That context does not lessen what happened to any individual Scottish sailor, but the history asks to be seen whole. It was a century in which forced labor was an engine of several economies, run by several peoples, all of whom understood its logic perfectly well. The letters survive in fragments. A man writes home from captivity. He chooses his words carefully. He knows the letter may be opened and read before it reaches Scotland. Fear sits beneath every sentence, kept there deliberately. One letter, cited in the records of a Scottish Privy Council petition from the 1640s, describes the writer as well and working. He asks his family to act without delay. He does not describe his work. He does not describe his lodging. He writes the things that will reach his wife without arousing intervention and trusts her to read the spaces. Another letter, preserved in a parish archive in the east of Scotland, is shorter still. 3 sentences, the name of the port, that the writer is alive, that he hopes they remember him. The handwriting is careful at the start and less careful by the end, as if he began steadily and faltered. These letters were carried by intermediaries, merchants with connections in Moroccan ports, ransomed men carrying correspondence for those who remained, consular agents who managed a steady traffic in such things. The route was slow and not guaranteed. Some letters arrived years after they were written. Some never arrived at all. In Scotland, the first response to a captured man was almost always the same. His family went to the kirk. Scotland's parish kirk sessions were the administrative backbone of local life. They managed the poor, they adjudicated disputes, they kept the records of baptism and marriage and death. They were also the mechanism through which communities dealt with collective misfortune. A captive sailor was collective misfortune. The session would hear the case. A family member, usually a wife or a mother, would present what evidence she had. A letter, a report from another sailor who had seen her husband taken, a rumor from the docks. The session would deliberate and then act. A public intimation from the pulpit on the Sunday. The minister reads the name and the circumstance. The congregation listens. These are people who know the family. Some of them knew the man. The copper coins go into the plate at the door. This is the human texture of the ransom economy at its most local. Not diplomats or merchants or state machinery. A fishing community pressing what it could spare into a wooden plate, knowing the name of the man they were trying to buy back. The Kirk session records for the Presbytery of Dunfermline show an intimation in January 1675 for two men of Inverkeithing, Walter Gibbison and John Reed. Taken on the Barbary coast, held at a location the records do not specify. The collection was taken up. The amount is noted. It was modest. Inverkeithing in 1675 is a small harbour town on the north shore of the Forth. The men of the town work the water. Most families have someone at sea. When an intimation is read for Gibbison and Reed, everyone in the congregation understands the arithmetic of what has happened. The records do not tell us clearly whether both men came home. That uncertainty is itself part of the history. Not every story resolves. The collection was taken up. What happened after is silence. Other parishes show the same pattern across the same decades. Kirkcaldy, Pittenweem, Anstruther, the small Fife fishing communities who had always understood the sea as a place of earning and risk both. Their session books contain the names. The Privy Council of Scotland also moved on these cases when the numbers warranted. When several men from a region were taken in a short period, petitions reached Edinburgh asking for collections to be authorised across wider areas. The machinery reached from the plate at the door to the council table. Beyond the parish, there were professional intermediaries. Merchants with established trading ties to Moroccan and Algerian ports were sometimes engaged to carry ransom money and to negotiate its application. Consuls and agents in the port cities knew the protocols. They had done this before, and they would do it again. The ransom price was not fixed. It varied with the perceived skill and value of the captive, with the negotiating position of whoever was acting for him, with the broader diplomatic temperature between Britain and the relevant authority. A navigator might be held for years while the price was argued. A common deckhand might move through the system faster. The arithmetic of a man's freedom was worked out without him. This is a strange fact that the records make plain. Men sat in the bagnio or worked at whatever they had been assigned, while somewhere across the sea, in parish sessions and counting houses and council chambers, other people were calculating what he was worth. There was also the question of conversion. The records are careful here, and so will we be. Some captives converted to Islam during their time in North Africa. The reasons varied. Some were under genuine pressure, some sought better conditions or greater freedom of movement, some came to believe in the faith they had adopted. For the families back in Scotland, conversion added a layer of complexity to the question of return. A man who had converted might not wish to come home, might face difficulty if he did. The Kirk was not certain what to make of such cases, and the session records show the uncertainty. For the Church of 17th century Scotland, a man who had converted was a problem without a clean solution. Some sessions treated returning converts with severity. Others, the records suggest, were more measured, understanding something of what the men had been through. Some men did not come home at all, not because they died and not because they stayed willingly, but because the money was never raised, the negotiations never concluded, the years passed, and the trail went cold. The plate at the door was not always enough. Others returned. The returns were not always what either side had imagined. A man held for 3 years or 5 years came back older, quieter, marked by the experience in ways he may not have been able to name. He returned to a wife who had not been a wife in any practical sense during his absence, who had run the household and managed the money and made decisions alone. He returned to children who had grown, or in some cases to children who had been born while he was gone. The adjustment was real, and the records give us only occasional glimpses of it. Some returning captives were asked to testify before the Kirk session about their experience. The records of these testimonies are among the most immediate documents the period provides. A man describing, in plain speech, what he saw and where he was and what was done to him. The sessions recorded these accounts for practical reasons, to support other ransom cases, to document the need for continued collections. One account from a returned Scottish sailor in the 1660s describes the port of Salé in specific physical terms. The white walls of the town visible from the water. The crowd on the quayside when a prize ship came in. The smell of the city, which he calls close and foreign, and unlike anything he had known. He does not speak with hatred of the people he met. He speaks with the careful plainness of a man reporting what he saw. These testimonies are the closest we have to voices from inside the experience. They are not adventure stories. They are working documents given to the session in the same spirit that a man might give an account of a storm or a wreck. Matter of fact, trying to be accurate, trying to make the scale of the thing legible to people who had not been there. The Moroccan cities these men passed through were, of course, functioning places with their own lives entirely separate from the captive economy. Salé was a city of scholars and merchants and craftsmen. The Bou Regreg River between Salé and Rabat was busy with ordinary traffic. The Banlieue was one part of a city that was mostly something else. Ordinary Moroccan people lived alongside this system as ordinary people live alongside the systems of their time, accepting some things, questioning others, having no particular power over the structure within which they existed. The Corsair economy benefited some interests in the city and imposed costs on others. The records on that side are their own archive in Arabic, and they tell their own version of these same years. The ransom system began to function less frequently as the century turned toward 1700. European naval capacity was growing. The diplomatic appetite on both sides was shifting toward trade and away from captivity. The 1721 treaty between Britain and Morocco was one formal marker of a change that had been accumulating for years. The last major taking of British subjects by Moroccan Corsairs was earlier than this. By the 1720s, the threat was receding. Scottish coastal communities who had lived with the knowledge of that danger for 2 generations began, slowly, to let the anxiety loosen. But the names remained in the session books. The intimations that had been read from pulpits in towns along the Forth and the Ayrshire coast, the collections that had been taken up, the men who had come home and the men who had not, the record of what the communities had done for their own. That is what sits at the heart of this chapter, not the drama of capture, not the distant politics of Corsair economics, but the congregation pressing coins into a plate, a mother writing to the Privy Council in Edinburgh, a wife keeping house alone for 5 years, not knowing, the human machinery of care, slow and imperfect and real, turning toward the men who were gone. The Clyde and the Forth at night are quiet. The harbours that sent those men out are the same harbours that waited for them. Some of those men came back through the same water they had left by, older and surprised to be alive, stepping onto a quay that smelled of the same river mud and wet rope as it had on the morning they left. The same gulls overhead, the same grey sky. Let this settle. The Banyo fires are out. The ransom has been paid or it has not. The letters have arrived or they have been lost at sea. The man is home or he is not. The history does not resolve every case. It holds the uncertainty alongside the names, which is the only honest thing to do. The sea was not a barrier, it was a road, and sometimes the road brought men home. Chapter 4: Renegades and Returns. Not everyone who crossed came back the same, and some did not come back at all, not in the way their families had imagined. The Corsair world, for all the grief it caused, was also a world that some people moved into deliberately and found, in time, a kind of home. The word the era used was renegade. It meant a Christian who had converted to Islam and entered the service of a North African ruler. The word was loaded then as it is now. It was a word spoken by those who stayed behind, about those who did not. It carried the weight of judgment, but the records, read carefully, resist easy judgment. Some conversions were coerced, or at least heavily incentivized. A man held in a banyo in Salé, uncertain of ransom, watching the years lengthen, might find that conversion opened doors that captivity kept shut. The records suggest this was understood by everyone involved, including the men who converted. Others converted with something closer to conviction. They had arrived in Morocco as prisoners and found themselves in a civilization of considerable depth, learning Arabic, learning the forms of Islamic prayer, learning a way of living in the world that was not what they had been born to. The records do not always let us know which kind each man was. Perhaps he did not always know himself. The European renegades who rose highest in Moroccan service tended to be men with skills the Corsair fleets needed. Navigation above all. A man who could read stars and chart coastlines was worth far more than his ransom price. He was worth keeping, converting, promoting. Some of these men became captains. The records preserve a handful of names. Jan Jansoen, a Dutchman who became a commander at Salé in the 1620s, is the most documented. He is given the name Murad Reis. He leads Corsair expeditions as far as Iceland. He is useful and he knows it. Whether he believes is a question the records leave unanswered. Others came from closer to Scotland. The records note a handful of English and Scottish sailors who converted and remained. Their names are sometimes recorded in captivity lists and then absent from ransom records, the gap suggesting they did not return. Some of these gaps are explained by death. Some of them, the records suggest, are explained by choice. A ship's gunner from a northern port who converted in the 1650s and served on a Corsair vessel out of Salé left no memoir, no explanatory letter, no record of his inner life. What survives is his name in a list, and then his absence. The absence is its own kind of testimony. He was somewhere. He had reasons. The physicians are a distinct group. European medical knowledge was valued in Morocco, and European captives with medical training could find themselves practicing in circumstances they had never imagined. Some of these men converted and stayed. Others were eventually ransomed, carrying with them knowledge that moved in both directions. A French physician who spent several years in Morocco in the mid-17th century wrote an account after his return. He describes Moroccan medical practice with a scholar's attention, noting treatments he had not encountered in European training, herbal preparations used by Moroccan practitioners for conditions his own tradition had not mastered. He is critical in places. He is also clearly impressed. The exchange of medical knowledge across this divide is one of the less examined parts of the story. Moroccan physicians had access to traditions stretching back through Andalusian and Arab scholarship that European medicine had partly lost and was slowly recovering. A European prisoner with medical training who spent years working alongside Moroccan practitioners was receiving an education. Some of the renegades who served in Moroccan courts acted as interpreters and intermediaries, as well as soldiers and technicians. They occupied a position that was genuinely between worlds, trusted by neither side, entirely useful to both. The records suggest some of them managed this with considerable skill. The Moroccan sultans of the 17th century were experienced at deploying foreign expertise. Sultan Moulay Ismail, who ruled from 1672 to 1727, maintained a sophisticated court that drew on multiple traditions. He was interested in what Europeans could offer and clear-eyed about the political dimensions of receiving it. His relationship with European renegades in his service was transactional and occasionally respectful. The renegades left their own small marks on the architecture of Moroccan coastal defenses in this period. European knowledge of fortification, of artillery placement, of the angles that made a harbor defensible, passed from converted soldiers into the stonework of Moroccan walls. Some of what was built with this knowledge still stands. The records are quiet about the men who contributed it. Then there are the captives who came home and wrote. They are the other side of the renegade story, the men who crossed, endured, and returned, and who found that they had something Europe wanted to read. The genre of Barbary captivity narrative was well established by the mid-17th century. Readers in Britain and across northern Europe were hungry for accounts of captivity in North Africa, partly from fear, partly from genuine curiosity about a world they could not otherwise reach. The narratives sold well. Some of them were reprinted many times. The most famous of these in British memory is probably William Oakley, who published his account of captivity in Algiers in 1675. He was held for 5 years. He escaped in a canvas boat of his own construction, which is the kind of detail that sells books. He was eventually in England. He wrote it all down. His account is remarkable partly for what it is not. It is not a catalogue of horror. Oakley writes about his captors with a precision that is not flattering, but is not without acknowledgement of their humanity. He describes life in the bagnio with a journalist's eye, noting the daily rhythms, the commerce, the small negotiations of captive life. He is fair in a way that his century did not demand of him. Scottish captives produced their own accounts, fewer in number but specific to Scottish experience. The records suggest that several men from Scottish ports wrote letters home that were preserved by Kirk sessions and occasionally printed as pamphlets. These are not polished literary works. They are functional documents, proof of life, appeals for ransom, inventories of need. But in the years after their return, some of these men were asked to speak, to describe what they had seen. They did so in church halls and counting houses and the parlors of merchants who had a commercial interest in the Moroccan coasts. They became, briefly, authorities on a world their neighbors would never see. Their accounts, however partial, shifted what Scotland thought it knew. The Moroccan cities these captives described were not barbaric places. They were cities with markets and mosques and administrative systems and scholars. The captives who reported honestly on what they had seen were conveying, whether they meant to or not, the complexity of a functioning civilization. Some of the returning captives described the Moroccan treatment of captives with more nuance than the pamphlet sellers wanted. A man held in a household rather than a bagnio, treated decently by the family he worked for, fed adequately, not physically abused, returned home with a picture of Morocco that did not match the nightmare his community had been imagining. This dissonance left traces in the accounts. The negotiation between what the captive had actually experienced and what his readers wanted to hear is visible in many of these narratives. A man who returns with a more complicated story than simple victimhood is not always believed or not always heard clearly. The genre had its own demands. The market had its own expectations. And yet the complicated accounts survived. They survived because the men who wrote them were, in some cases, more interested in truthfulness than in marketability. A ship's carpenter from a Fife port who spent 2 years in Salé and returned in 1668 left a short memoir in manuscript that a Kirk session copied for its own records. He does not sensationalize. He describes. He is curious about what he has seen, even as he is glad to have left it. The returning captives also brought back languages. A man who had spent years in Salé or in Algiers had, of necessity, learned enough Arabic to manage his daily life. When he came home, that knowledge came with him. Some of it persisted. There are records of former captives serving as interpreters for merchants negotiating with Moroccan factors. The suffering had produced, alongside itself, a kind of knowledge. This is one of the ways difficult history works. Something painful produces, as a residue, something useful. The captives who came home carrying Arabic and Moroccan understanding became, in small ways, a bridge between the two worlds. They had not asked to be bridges. They had asked to come home. But the crossing had made them something, and they carried it. The books written by returning captives found their way into Scottish households. The records suggest that captivity narratives were among the more widely read secular books of the later 17th century in Scottish homes that had books at all. A minister in a coastal parish might own one. A merchant dealing in the Mediterranean trade would almost certainly have read one. These books changed the picture. Before them, Morocco existed in Scottish imagination largely as a threat, the source of the Corsairs, the destination of the unlucky. After the captivity narratives, Morocco became also a place with streets and architecture and a daily life, harsh in some of its dealings with captives, but not incomprehensible, not simply alien. The Moroccan view of Europeans was being shaped in parallel, though through different mechanisms. Moroccan scholars and travelers who had contact with European captives or with European merchants wrote their own accounts. These circulated in manuscript and later in print, within Moroccan and broader Arabic-reading learned culture. A Moroccan scholar who observed European captives working in Salé in the 1650s wrote a short passage in a longer historical work noting their industry and their visible grief. He does not pity them in a way that diminishes them. He records what he sees, men a long way from home, working hard, hoping. It is a small passage. It is also an act of witness. The image of Scotland that reached Morocco through these channels was partial and refracted. Scotland was not a country Morocco thought about as a distinct entity. It was part of the European north, the cold lands from which ships came. But the ships came from specific ports, and the sailors spoke specific languages. And over time, the port cities of Morocco developed an experience of specific European peoples that was more particular than the general category of Christian European. The renegades who served longest in Moroccan courts became, in time, participants in a different kind of exchange. They attended diplomatic meetings. They translated letters. They knew both sides of a negotiation from the inside in a way that no one who had stayed home could match. Their value to the Moroccan court was precisely this dual knowledge, bought at a high personal cost. Some of them tried to return. The records document a handful of cases where renegades in old age sought reinstatement in European society, writing to bishops or civic authorities, claiming that their conversion had been coerced, seeking absolution and the possibility of dying at home. The church authorities of the time were not always accommodating, but some of these men did find their way back. They died in the parishes they had been baptized in, decades after anyone had expected to see them again. Others died in Morocco. A man who had converted at 25 and served the Sultan for 40 years was, at 65, no longer the Scotsman or Englishman he had once been. Morocco was where he knew how to live. The language of the city was his language. The call to prayer had marked his days for longer than he could clearly remember a time before it. The records suggest, in the quiet of their gaps, that he did not grieve this. The port cities of Morocco, Salé and Tangier, and the earlier Moroccan Atlantic harbors were in this period genuinely cosmopolitan in the strict sense, places where people of many origins lived alongside each other, bound by commercial and political ties rather than shared origin. Renegades were one part of this. Jewish merchants were another. Andalusian families whose ancestors had been expelled from Spain in 1492 were a third. The cities were built from all of them. A former gunner from Aberdeen, converted and settled in Salé in the 1640s, would have had Moroccan neighbors, Andalusian neighbors, Jewish neighbors, and other European renegades from a dozen nations. The world he woke up in each morning was not the world he had been born to. Whether he found it strange or had simply stopped noticing the strangeness is a question the records cannot answer. What the returning captives brought back to Scotland and what the renegades left behind in Morocco both point toward the same truth. The crossing changed people. The sea was a road, and roads go both ways, and anyone who travels a road for long enough is not quite the same person who started walking. The captivity narratives that circulated in Scotland in the later 17th and early 18th centuries created, in Scottish literary culture, the first sustained image of Morocco as a complex place rather than simply a danger. It was an incomplete image, filtered through fear and loss and the demands of the genre, but it was a beginning. By the 1720s, when the Treaty of Peace and Friendship between Britain and Morocco was being concluded, there were people in Edinburgh and Glasgow and the coastal boroughs who had read the captivity accounts, who had perhaps heard a returning captive speak in a church hall, who had a more textured picture of Morocco than simple threat. This picture was one of the things that made a treaty imaginable. The renegades and the returning captives are the most human evidence of what the crossing did to people, not the ledgers of trade, not the language of treaties, but the figure of a man changed by his time on the other side of the sea. A carpenter who came home with Arabic, a gunner who stayed and learned to pray facing a different direction, a physician who crossed knowledge between traditions. None of these figures appear in the grand histories. They appear in Kirk session records and captivity pamphlets and the occasional passing reference in a consul's dispatch. They lived in the margins of their own time, but they were there, in the space between Scotland and Morocco, carrying something of each place in them. The chapter of the renegades is not a comfortable one to sit with. It contains coercion and loss, and the hard arithmetic of what people do under sustained pressure. It also contains, alongside those things, something that looks like adaptation and choice, and in some cases something that looks like the discovery of a life. Both things are in the record. Both deserve to be said. The captives who came home and wrote gave Scotland something it had not asked for, a literature of encounter. The Corsair century had been a century of fear. The captivity narratives turned some of that fear into something more detailed, more particular, more human. Morocco was still dangerous in these accounts. It was also knowable. It had streets and seasons, and the smell of its own particular air. There is a small, specific image in one of the captivity accounts from the 1670s. The writer is in Salé. It is evening. He is looking out from the bagnio toward the harbor. He can see the masts of the ships. He can hear the sound of the city going about its evening, and he hears gulls. He does not remark on this at length. He simply notes, the gulls are the same. He means it as a recognition of home, a thin thread back to the harbors he knows. But the observation is wider than he intends it. The gulls move between these coasts. They do not keep the distinctions that the politics of the century insist on. They circle the harbor at Salé in the same arcs they circle the harbor at Leith. The sea below them is continuous. The sky above them is one sky. The renegades and the returning captives are both, in their different ways, evidence of what happens when those distinctions become complicated by experience. A man who has lived for years on the other side of the sea carries both shores in him. He is not simply one thing anymore. He is the road itself, in human form. The records do not linger on this. They are records, lists of names, amounts of ransom, dates of return. They move on quickly to the next transaction. But the human freight of those names is heavier than the records suggest, and it is worth slowing down to feel the weight of it here at this hour when there is nothing to do but listen. Let these figures rest now. The converted gunner in his Moroccan house, the returned carpenter, older and quieter, back in his Fife parish, the physician who moved between two traditions of healing and came home carrying both, the navigator who chose to stay, who found a life in a language he had not been born to. They were all, in their different ways, the story working itself out in individual people. Their crossings made both places different in ways too small to measure and too real to dismiss. A piece of European fortification knowledge in a Moroccan wall. A piece of Arabic in the memory of a man who returned to Scotland and used it occasionally when the trade required it. Knowledge does not stay where it is put. It travels the same roads the people travel. The sea between Scotland and Morocco is carrying all of this still, in the way that old water carries old crossings. Not literally, not in any sense that science would confirm, but in the sense that the routes these people traced are still the routes, and the wind that filled their sails is the same wind. The Atlantic does not distinguish between the voyages it has carried. Sit with the quiet of it for a moment. The story of the renegades and the returners is not a story with a clean conclusion. It is a story that simply continues into other stories. The Treaty of 1721 and the merchants who followed it, the diplomats and travelers of the 19th century, all of them are built on what the Corsair century left behind, including the complicated human residue of people who crossed and changed. The two harbors are a little quieter now. The history of this chapter is settling. The names in the Kirk session records, the names in the ransom lists, the names of the captains who converted and the captains who came home, all settling into the deeper quiet of the past, where things that were painful become things that were real, and being real is enough. The amber light is still on the white walls of the Moroccan coast. The grey rain is still on the Clyde. The same gulls circle both harbors as they always have, as they will through the night and into the morning. They know nothing of the history. They know the water and the wind and the reliable presence of both. That is enough for them. Let it be enough for now. In Chapter 5, Toward the Peace. Through the first half of the 18th century, Morocco lives with two economies running side by side. The Corsair fleets still sail. The merchant houses still trade. Both are instruments of the state. Both serve the Sultan's purposes. But the balance is shifting. European naval power is growing steadily, and the coastal towns of the North Atlantic are growing less tolerant of the risk. The Corsair economy, which once operated from a position of strength, begins to feel the pressure of changed circumstances. The sultans are not slow to read this. The Alawi dynasty has governed Morocco since the 1660s. Their great achievement is survival. They have held a complex kingdom together through plague and famine, and the constant attention of European powers that would be glad to see Morocco weakened. Moulay Ismail, who rules until 1727, understands captives as diplomacy. He holds European prisoners not simply as commodities, but as leverage. The records suggest he is a calculating ruler in this, as in everything. He knows when to negotiate and when to hold. After his death, Morocco passes through a period of instability. Several sultans follow in quick succession. The kingdom contracts around its core. The Corsair fleets continue, but without the same central direction. The ransom economy persists by its own momentum. Then, in 1757, something changes. A new sultan comes to power. His name is Mohammed ben Abdallah. He is 30 years old. He has grown up watching the consequences of the old approach. He has drawn his own conclusions. He comes to the throne with a different idea of what Morocco should be. Not a kingdom feared for its raiders, a kingdom valued for its commerce. He wants European ships at his wharves and European merchants at his tables. He wants the wealth that trade brings, not the precarious income of the ransom market. He moves with purpose. In his first decade of rule, he signs peace treaties with one European power and then another. Denmark in 1767, Sweden the year after, Britain, France, the Italian states. He clears the diplomatic ground systematically, country by country. These are not instruments of submission. They are instruments of commerce. Mohammed ben Abdallah is not opening Morocco to European dominance. He is opening it to European trade on terms that he sets. The distinction matters, and he holds it clearly. The Corsair fleets do not vanish overnight. These things never end cleanly. There are interests invested in the old system, families and port cities whose livelihoods depend on it. But the Sultan's direction is unmistakable. The weather is changing. The Corsair century is closing like a long storm finally clearing from the west. The records from this period show a gradual shift in the language of the treaties. Earlier agreements were temporary, specific, fragile. The new agreements use different language: perpetual peace, firm friendship. The words carry intention. Both sides are committing to something more permanent. Now hold what this means for the Scottish families who had spent the previous century pressing coins into Kirk collection plates. The threat that had shaped their understanding of the sea, the knowledge that a voyage south carried a particular danger, that threat is receding. It does not disappear in a year or a decade, but the direction is clear. By the 1760s, the coastlines of Scotland and Morocco face each other across a changed Atlantic. Not safe, oceans are never safe, but changed. The balance between risk and trade has shifted. The merchants can begin to plan with greater confidence. The calculus of the crossing has been rewritten. Mohammed bin Abdullah is not finished. A treaty is one thing, a port is something else. He knows that the best instrument of commerce is infrastructure. He looks at his Atlantic coast and sees what is missing, a deep-water harbor designed for the trade he intends. The site he chooses is on the Atlantic shore, 3 days south of Tangier. A crescent of rocks that breaks the swell, a natural shelter, fresh water nearby. The wind that blows off the ocean here is reliable and useful, pushing ships north toward Europe on the outward run. The records suggest that construction begins in earnest in 1765. The architect brought in is a Frenchman, a man named Cornut, and the plan he draws is deliberate and rational. Wide streets on a grid, a medina enclosed by dressed stone walls, warehouses along the waterfront. The Sultan names the new city Mogador, or rather, that is what the European traders will call it, bending the older Berber name Essaouira into a shape their tongues can manage. The city its own people call Essaouira, the little ramparts, the small harbor wall. The Sultan gives this new port something valuable, a monopoly. Everything coming up from the interior of the country, the wool from the Atlas foothills, the copper and hides from the caravan routes, the gum Arabic from further south, all of it must pass through Essaouira and through the customs system he controls there. He also does something shrewd with the city's population. He invites trading families to settle in the new port. Jewish merchants in particular, families with deep roots in Moroccan life and commercial networks that stretch across the Mediterranean and into northern Europe. They come. The city fills with people who know how to trade. Stand at the Essaouira quayside in the early years of the city, perhaps 1775 or so, and try to see it. The walls are still new, the stone not yet weathered grey. The streets are clean and purposeful. Porters move bales on their shoulders, sure-footed on the wet harbour stone. The smell is wool and sea salt and the warm lanolin of the Atlas fleece. The ships in the harbour are varied. Moroccan vessels alongside Portuguese and British and Danish flags, small brigs, mostly suited to the Atlantic swell. Their holds are being loaded and unloaded in the grey morning light. A clerk stands at the gate with a ledger, marking each bale as it passes. This is the new Morocco that the Sultan has built. The European merchants who come to Essaouira find a city that is entirely Moroccan in its character. The call to prayer crosses the Medina 5 times each day. The Friday quiet is absolute. The market inside the old walls sells things that no European city can offer. They are guests in a system designed by the Sultan and run on Moroccan terms. They also find comfort. The city has houses designed for European occupants, rooms with shuttered windows against the afternoon sun. The trading house kitchens produce approximations of European food. There is a community of fellow merchants to eat with in the evenings. The Sultan has thought about this. He wants them to stay and to come back. The Moroccan merchants they work with are sophisticated. The Jewish trading families of Essaouira, the Corcos family and the Afriat family and others speak Arabic and Judeo-Berber and Spanish, and often French and some English as well. They know the interior routes. They know the suppliers of gum Arabic and the dealers in copper far inland. They are indispensable, and they know it. A Scottish merchant who understands this situation does not try to work around these intermediaries. He works with them. He pays the broker's commission and considers it well spent. The man who knows which mountain pass is open in November and which supplier has a reputation for short waiting is worth more than any direct contract a court could enforce. What does Scotland bring to Essaouira? The same things it is selling everywhere in this century. Cloth above all, linen from the growing mills of Dundee and Fife, strong enough to bear the Atlantic crossing. Woolen cloth from the borders and the lowland farms. Plain weave and twilled, serviceable and durable. What comes back north? Leather from the tanning yards of Fez, worked to a suppleness that Scottish craftsmen find difficult to achieve at home, dyed in the deep reds and yellows that Moroccan artisans have perfected over centuries. Almonds from the foothills, beeswax for candles and polish, hides and copper, and the gum Arabic the apothecaries want. The trade rarely runs directly, ship to ship, between Leith and Essaouira. It moves through London and Lisbon and Gibraltar, through intermediary merchants who take their percentage at each step. The Scottish wool and the Moroccan leather are heading toward each other, but through many hands. That is how the Atlantic trade works. The ships themselves are modest, brigs drawing little water, suited to the variable swell off the Atlantic ports. A Leith-registered vessel might carry 200 or 300 tons of cloth south and return with wool and wax and a few crates of the dyed leather that Edinburgh saddlers and London fashioners want. The trading year has its own rhythm, set by weather and by the Moroccan interior. Spring, the new wool clip arrives at the coastal warehouses, carried down from the Atlas by mule train. Early summer, the loading season, the quaysides busy with bales and manifests. Autumn, the last ships of the season running north before the Atlantic weather finds them. The patience required for this trade is real and measurable. A letter from Glasgow to Essaouira might take 3 weeks in fair conditions. A firm reply with an order might take 6 weeks more. By the time the cargo is loaded and sailing, the merchant who placed the original order has been waiting 4 months at least. Patience is the merchant's first tool. The second is trust. That trust is built slowly through consistency. The agent who delivers what he promises, who warns of a shortfall before it becomes a dispute, who passes on the intelligence that a mountain route has closed early this year and the wool will be late. That agent is worth every penny of his commission and more. The soul of this trade is not adventure, it is reliability. Two peoples on opposite ends of the same ocean, each with what the other needs, building slowly the infrastructure of mutual confidence. The Sultan's city at one end of the route, the Clyde merchants at the other, the careful letters going back and forth across the water between them. Now it is evening in Essaouira. The light has been extraordinary all afternoon, the flat white Atlantic light that makes the city look like it is made of chalk. It softens now into amber as the sun drops toward the water. The walls of the Medina take on a warmth they do not have in the middle of the day. The porters have gone home. The quayside is quiet. The wool bales loaded this morning are already below decks, in the hold of the brig at the far end of the harbour, arranged against the ribs of the hull. The ship will sail on the morning tide. The Kirkcaldy mills are waiting. The invoice is written. The bill of lading is signed and in 2 copies. Inside one of the trading houses, a lamp burns late over the accounts. The figures must balance before the ship sails. A clerk copies from a crumpled bill of lading into a bound ledger, the numbers in sterling and in Spanish dollars both. The scratch of the pen is the only sound in the inner room. Outside, the Atlantic is doing what it has always done. The Corsairs are not sailing tonight. They have not sailed in force for several years now. The treaties the Sultan signed have altered the logic of the crossing. The European vessels in this harbour have a different relationship to the sea than they had a generation ago. The fear that shaped the last century has not gone entirely, but it is receding like weather moving off. The Sultan's choice made this possible. Not any single treaty, not any single act of state, but the cumulative weight of a deliberate decision to trade rather than to raid, to build a city rather than to dismantle ships, to be a nation valued for what it sells rather than feared for what it takes. That decision changed the Atlantic for everyone who sailed it. It also changed something in the parishes of coastal Scotland. The intimations from the pulpit grew fewer. The collections for ransomed men grew rarer. The silence at a harbourside door when a ship was overdue became, slowly, a silence about storms and weather rather than a silence about a specific older kind of danger. The Kirk session records trace this change in what they stop recording. The Corsair century is not a simple story of victims and perpetrators. The records insist on that. European nations ran their own enormous slaving economies across the Atlantic throughout this same period. Ships out of Bristol and Lisbon and Amsterdam, the ledgers of forced labor running on an enormous scale. The Barbary captive and the Atlantic slave share a century, though not a fate. The honest account holds both. What Mohammed ben Abdallah's reign closes is one chapter of this larger story, the Barbary captivity of Northern Europeans. By the 1780s, the threat that had shaped 2 generations of Scottish coastal life has largely passed. It leaves its traces in the parish records, in the names still legible in the Kirk session minutes, in the families who waited and sometimes received their men back and sometimes did not. The Sultan builds his city and it works. By the 1780s, Essaouira is one of the most important Atlantic ports south of Lisbon. The trade is substantial. The network of merchants, Moroccan and Jewish and European, has become a functioning system. The wool comes down from the Atlas and goes north on Scottish and British ships. The cloth goes south from the Clyde Mills and disappears into the Moroccan interior. Two nations, at last, meeting mainly as traders. The road that the sea has always offered, finally being used as the road it is. Let the chapter settle there. The wind has dropped in Essaouira. The evening is still. The amber light on the white walls is fading now into the blue-grey of dusk. The harbour lanterns are being lit, one by one, their reflections breaking and reforming in the small dark waves against the harbour wall. The same gulls that hang above the Clyde are here too, tilting in the Atlantic updraft above the ramparts. They do not care about treaties or commerce or the architecture of ransom. They follow the light on the water and the smell of fish and the warmth that rises from the sun-warmed stone. The same birds over both harbours, the same economy of wing and hunger. Follow the water northward now in your mind. Up the Atlantic face of Europe, past the strait where two seas meet, past the Bay of Biscay with its long swells, up through the latitudes where the water turns grey-green and cold. The temperature of the air is dropping. The light is different here. Scotland is late in the evening. The Clyde is dark and quiet. A brig sits at the Leith quayside, its hold empty, waiting for the wool bales that will arrive in the morning from the warehouse on the long road. The manifest is written. The tide tables are checked. Tomorrow the work begins again. In a counting house on the street above the quay, a lamp burns at a desk. A merchant is writing to his agent in Essaouira. He wants to know whether the new clip from the Atlas approaches will be ready by April. He wants to know whether the road through the mountains is reliable this year. He wants to know whether the beeswax consignment that was short-waited in November has been resolved. He writes carefully. The letter will take 3 weeks to arrive. The reply will take 3 weeks more. He is comfortable with this. He has done business across this distance for 15 years. He knows the names of the men at the other end of the route, as well as he knows his neighbours on the Leith waterfront. The sea between them is a road he has learned to read. Two old nations, settled now into the long, ordinary business of trade. The Corsair century behind them, the counting house in front of them, the wool bales and the cloth bales moving back and forth across the water on modest ships, in careful manifests, in letters that cross in the night somewhere off the Bay of Biscay. Tomorrow night there is more of this story to tell. The merchants who settle in each other's cities, the white city of Essaouira filling with voices and languages, and the smell of cedar from the interior. The families who come and stay. The relationships built over decades that outlast the paperwork. The records that dry and yellow in the archives, while the connections they document continue in the living world. But that is tomorrow. For now, the harbours rest. Essaouira in its Atlantic dusk, the amber light gone from the walls, the Medina folding into its nighttime quiet, the Clyde in its grey northern dark, the river carrying everything slowly to the sea. The same moon is above both coastlines tonight. The same moon that has moved over this particular stretch of ocean since before any ship was built to sail it. It does not distinguish between the harbours beneath it. It lights both equally, the white walls and the dark water and the moored boats, and the sleeping city, and the gulls resting on the old stone. The sea between Scotland and Morocco is doing what it always does, moving, breathing, connecting every coast to every other coast as it has always done, quietly and without ceremony. You do not need to hold any of this. Let it go with your breath. The harbour lanterns are lit. The treaties are signed. The wool bales are in the hold. The letter is written and folded and sealed. Everything is in order for tomorrow. The waves arrive. The waves withdraw in Esyoera, in Lath, steady and unhurried and entirely reliable. There is nothing more reliable in the world than this. You can rest inside it. The sea is not a barrier. It never was. It is a road, and the road is open, and the ships are sleeping at their moorings, and the merchants have gone home. Good night from Tartan Lullaby, Part 2 tomorrow night when the merchants arrive. That's where we'll leave it for tonight. The story is finished, but the night isn't, so let this play on as long as it helps. If Tartan Lullaby has been good company, you're welcome to subscribe so the next story finds you. There's no rush. If you'd like to see the landscapes that go with these stories, the art prints are at Tartan Lullaby Art on Etsy, with mood boards and stills on Pinterest under the same name. The links are in the description below. Until next time, thank you for listening. Sleep well, all is well.